She cried at the funeral. She wore black for weeks. She told every reporter, every neighbor, every friend that she had lost the love of her life. And people believed her. Why wouldn't they? Pamela Smart was 22 years old. She was articulate. She was composed. She worked at a high school. She looked like someone you would trust with your children. But the boy she had trusted with her darkest secret told a very different story. Miles ghost hunter here. Some widows grieve, others orchestrate, and this is the case that proved it on tape. Before we get to the tape, before we get to the trial that would become the first fully televised murder case in American history, before we get to the moment when a 15-year-old boy sat in a witness chair and described how a grown woman bent his mind until he agreed to do the unthinkable, we need to talk about the man who lost his life. Because in the circus that followed, in the media frenzy and the made-for-TV spectacle, one person got forgotten: the victim, the husband, the man who came home on a Tuesday evening in May and never walked out again. His name was Gregg Smart. Everyone called him Gregg. Gregg Smart was born in 1965 in New Hampshire. He grew up in Derry, a small town about 30 miles south of Concord. If you know the name Derry, it might be because Stephen King used it as the setting for some of his darkest novels. But the real Derry was quieter than fiction. Milltown roots, working-class families, the kind of place where people left their doors unlocked and knew their neighbors by name. Gregg was the kind of person that small towns produce at their best. He was easygoing. He smiled a lot. He played baseball in high school and wasn't bad at it. He liked cars, liked tinkering with engines, liked hanging out with his buddies on weekends. After high school, he went to work in insurance sales. Not glamorous, but steady. He was building something, step by step. In 1987, Gregg Smart met a young woman named Pamela Smart at a New Year's Eve party. She was from the same part of New Hampshire, a couple of towns over. She was bright, energetic, ambitious. She had a degree in media communications from Florida State University. She wanted to be on television someday. She had plans, big plans. They started dating. By all accounts, the early relationship was intense. Pamela was driven. Gregg was easygoing. She pushed. He followed. It worked, for a while. On May 7th, 1989, they got married. Gregg was 23, Pamela was 21. They moved into a condominium on Misty Morning Drive in Derry. A modest place, nothing extravagant, but it was theirs. Gregg continued his insurance work. Pamela got a job as the media coordinator at Winnacunnet High School in Hampton, about 40 minutes east. Her role was to run the school's media center, organize video projects, and supervise student volunteers. For a while, the newlyweds looked like any other young couple in southern New Hampshire. They had friends over. They went out. They talked about starting a family. Gregg wanted children. He talked about it often. He imagined coaching Little League someday, just like his father had coached him. But by the fall of 1989, less than 6 months after the wedding, something had shifted. The marriage was in trouble. Pamela later told friends that she felt trapped. She said Gregg was too comfortable, too content, too willing to settle for a small life in a small town. She wanted more. More excitement, more attention, more. And she found it. At Winnacunnet High School, Pamela Smart had access to something that most 22-year-old women in troubled marriages do not have. She had daily, unsupervised access to teenagers who admired her. She was young. She was attractive. She had authority. And she had a title that gave her a reason to spend hours alone with students after school. One of those students was a 15-year-old boy named William Flynn. Everyone called him Billy. Billy Flynn was a sophomore. He was quiet, somewhat awkward, looking for direction. He was not a troublemaker. He was not a criminal. He was a kid. And when the pretty, confident, older woman who ran the media center started paying special attention to him, he did what most 15-year-old boys would do. He responded. Pamela Smart would later claim that the relationship was exaggerated, that Billy Flynn pursued her, that she was the victim of teenage infatuation taken too far. But the evidence would tell a different story entirely. Now let me take you to the day that changed everything. May 1st, 1990. It was a Tuesday, an ordinary spring evening in Derry, New Hampshire. The trees were just beginning to green. Gregg Smart finished work and drove home to the condominium on Misty Morning Drive. He arrived sometime around 7 in the evening. Pamela was not home. She had told him she had a meeting at the school, something related to the media program. She would be late. Gregg let himself in. He probably set down his keys, maybe loosened his tie. He was 24 years old, and it was a Tuesday, and there was no reason in the world to think that this particular evening would be any different from the hundreds of evenings that had come before. But when Pamela Smart left for her meeting that night, she already knew what was going to happen inside that condominium. She knew because she had spent months making sure it would happen. At approximately 9:30 that evening, Pamela Smart returned home. She walked through the front door and found her husband on the floor of the hallway. She called 911. She was hysterical. She screamed into the phone that someone had broken in, that her husband was hurt, that he was not moving. Emergency services arrived within minutes. Gregg Smart was pronounced dead at the scene. He had suffered a single fatal wound to the head. He was 24 years old. The initial assessment by Derry police was that it looked like a burglary gone wrong. The condo showed signs of a struggle. A few items were overturned. The front door showed no signs of forced entry, but the investigators theorized that perhaps the door had been left unlocked, or perhaps Gregg had opened it himself. But almost immediately, things did not add up. Nothing of significant value was taken. The television was still there, the stereo was still there. Cash in a drawer in the bedroom was untouched. If this was a burglary, it was the most incompetent burglary in the history of Rockingham County. A man was dead, and nothing was missing. Detectives Daniel Pelletier and Barry Charowitz of the Derry Police Department took the lead on the case. They canvassed the neighborhood. They interviewed Pamela Smart. They interviewed friends and family. They ran forensics on the condo. And they hit a wall. No fingerprints, no witnesses. No one in the quiet neighborhood of Misty Morning Drive had seen anything unusual that evening. No strange cars, no unfamiliar faces. In a town where everyone knew everyone, nobody knew anything. The investigation stalled. Days turned into weeks. The Derry Police Department was a small force, and a case with no leads and no suspects was stretching their resources. Gregg Smart's family was devastated and desperate for answers. His father, William Smart, began making public appeals. His mother, Judith Smart, could barely function. And through it all, Pamela Smart played the role of the grieving widow. She appeared on local television news. She wept openly. She described Gregg as her soulmate. She talked about the life they had planned together, the children they had wanted, the future that had been stolen. She was convincing. She was very convincing. But behind the tears, something else was happening. Something the cameras could not see. In the weeks following Gregg Smart's death, a rumor began to circulate. Not among adults, not among the detectives or the neighbors or the grieving family. Among teenagers, students at Winnicunnet High School. The rumor was that Pamela Smart had been involved with a student, that the relationship was not just inappropriate, but physical, and that the student in question had something to do with what happened to Gregg Smart on the night of May 1st. These rumors reached the Derry police through an indirect channel. A student told a parent, the parent told another parent. Eventually, someone told a detective, and for the first time in weeks, the investigation had a direction. The name that kept coming up was Billy Flynn. Now at this point in the investigation, detectives had a problem. They had rumors, but rumors are not evidence. They had the name of a 15-year-old boy, but they had no physical evidence linking him to the crime scene. They had a theory that Pamela Smart might have been involved, but she was the grieving widow with a spotless public record and a sympathetic media profile. They needed more, and they found it in the most unlikely place. Her name was Cecelia Pierce. She was 16 years old. She was a student at Winnacunnet High School, and she was one of Pamela Smart's closest confidants. Cecelia Pierce had been part of Pamela Smart's inner circle of student volunteers. She had helped with media projects. She had spent time at Pamela's home. She had been privy to conversations that no 16-year-old should have been privy to, and she was scared. When detectives approached Cecelia Pierce in June of 1990, she was reluctant at first. She knew things. She had heard things. But Pamela Smart was an authority figure, an adult she had trusted, and the idea of betraying that trust was terrifying. But the detectives were patient. They explained the situation. They explained that a man was dead. They explained that if Cecelia knew something and stayed silent, she could be considered an accessory. Cecelia Pierce agreed to cooperate, and what she told detectives in that first interview changed the entire trajectory of the case. According to Cecelia Pierce, Pamela Smart had confided in her about the plan to have Gregg eliminated. Not vaguely, not hypothetically, specifically. Pamela had talked about wanting Gregg gone. She had talked about divorce being too complicated, too expensive, too messy. She had talked about insurance money, and she had talked about Billy Flynn. But Cecilia's testimony alone would not be enough to bring charges. Defense attorneys would tear apart the credibility of a 16-year-old girl recounting private conversations. The police needed something harder, something undeniable. They asked Cecelia Pierce to wear a wire. Let me pause here, because this is the moment where the Pamela Smart case goes from a small-town investigation to something that would change American legal history. A 16-year-old girl, terrified and conflicted, agreed to secretly record her conversations with Pamela Smart while wearing a concealed microphone provided by the Derry Police Department. Cecelia Pierce went back to Pamela Smart. She acted normal. She continued to be the loyal student, the trusted confidant. But now, every word Pamela Smart said was being captured on tape, and Pamela Smart talked. On those recordings, Pamela Smart discussed the events surrounding Gregg's death. She talked about what had happened. She instructed Cecelia on what to say if police came asking questions. She coached her on maintaining a consistent story. She talked about the need to stay calm, to stick to the narrative, to not deviate. She did not confess in explicit cinematic terms. She did not say the words that a screenwriter might put in a villain's mouth. But she said enough. More than enough. The recordings captured Pamela Smart actively managing a cover-up, directing a teenager to mislead law enforcement, and demonstrating intimate knowledge of details that only someone involved in the planning could have known. When detectives finally brought Billy Flynn in for questioning, he was no longer a rumor. He was a suspect with a name, a face, and a story that connected directly to the evidence. The only person who would ever love him. And then she introduced the idea. At first it was abstract. She talked about being unhappy in her marriage. She talked about feeling trapped. She talked about wishing Gregg would just disappear. She cried. She told Billy Flynn that if she divorced Gregg, she would lose everything. The condo, the insurance, the life she had built. She told him that there was no way out. And then, according to Billy Flynn, the conversations became specific. Pamela Smart told him that the only solution was for Gregg to be eliminated. She framed it not as a command, but as a consequence. If Billy truly loved her, he would do this for her. If he refused, and Vance Latime would enter the condo and wait for Gregg to come home. When he arrived, they would stage a robbery. The death would look like a burglary gone wrong. Pamela Smart would return home, discover the scene, and call 911. And that is exactly what happened. On the evening of May 1st, Billy Flynn, Patrick Randall, and Vance Latime entered the Smart condominium on misty morning drive. Pamela Smart had ensured they could get in. They waited in the dark. When Gregg Smart walked through the front door that evening, he was confronted by 3 teenagers he had never seen before. There was a struggle. It was brief. Patrick Randall held Gregg down. Billy Flynn, using a revolver that the group had obtained, ended Gregg Smart's life with a single act of violence. He was 24 years old. He had been married for less than a year. He had talked about coaching Little League. The 3 teenagers ransacked the condo to make it look like a burglary. They took a few items of minimal value to support the story. Then they left. Pamela Smart returned home later that evening, walked through the door, and gave the performance of her life. That is what happened on the night of May 1st, 1990. That is the truth that was buried beneath the tears and the television interviews and the black mourning clothes. Now, the arrest. On August 1st, 1990, 3 months after Gregg Smart's death, Pamela Smart was arrested and charged with conspiracy to commit murder, accomplice to first-degree murder, and witness tampering. Billy Flynn, Patrick Randall, and Vance Latime were arrested and charged separately. The arrest was front-page news across New Hampshire. The story had everything the media craved: a young, attractive woman, a dead husband, teenage accomplices, a forbidden relationship, secret recordings. Within days, the Pamela Smart case was national news. But the trial that followed was something else entirely, something that had never happened before in the United States. The trial of Pamela Smart began on March 4th, 1991, in the Rockingham County Superior Court in Exeter, New Hampshire. And from the very first day, it was clear that this was not going to be an ordinary trial. For the first time in American legal history, a murder trial was broadcast live, gavel to gavel. On television, the New Hampshire Supreme Court had approved cameras in the courtroom, and the media descended like locusts. Court TV, which had launched just months earlier, covered the trial in its entirety. Every major network sent correspondents. Satellite trucks lined the streets outside the courthouse. Pamela Smart's trial was America's first true crime reality show, years before the O.J. Simpson case, years before anyone coined the phrase, _0_. Millions of Americans watched live as the prosecution and defense fought over the fate of a 23-year-old woman accused of orchestrating her husband's murder. The lead prosecutor was Paul Maggiotto. He was methodical, precise, and relentless. His case rested on 3 pillars. First, the testimony of Billy Flynn, Patrick Randall, and Vance Latime. All 3 teenagers had agreed to cooperate with the prosecution in exchange for reduced charges. They would testify that Pamela Smart had planned the murder, manipulated Billy Flynn into carrying it out, and orchestrated every detail. Second, the secret recordings made by Cecelia Pierce. The tapes captured Pamela Smart coaching a teenager on how to lie to police, discussing details of the crime, and demonstrating knowledge that only a participant could possess. Third, the pattern of manipulation. Maggiotto intended to show the jury not just what Pamela Smart had done, but how she had done it. The grooming, the emotional dependency, the calculated use of a physical relationship to control a 15-year-old boy. The defense was led by Mark Sisti, a respected New Hampshire attorney. Sisti's strategy was direct and aggressive. His argument was this: Billy Flynn and his friends acted alone. They were teenagers, yes, but they were not puppets. They made their own choices. They pulled the trigger. And now, facing long prison sentences, they were blaming the convenient target, the older woman, the authority figure, the easy scapegoat. Sisti hammered at the credibility of the teenage witnesses. These were the people who had actually committed the crime, he argued. They were liars by definition. They had every incentive to shift blame, to minimize their own roles, to paint Pamela Smart as the mastermind in order to secure lighter sentences for themselves. As for the recordings made by Cecelia Pierce, Sisti argued that they were ambiguous. Pamela Smart never explicitly confessed on tape. She never said in plain language that she had ordered the death of her husband. What the tape showed, according to the defense, was a frightened woman trying to manage a chaotic situation, not a criminal mastermind directing a cover-up. It was a reasonable defense. On paper, it should have created doubt. But then Billy Flynn took the witness stand. The courtroom was packed. Cameras were rolling. Millions of Americans were watching from their living rooms. And a teenage boy, now 16 years old, sat in the witness chair and described, in plain, halting language, how a grown woman had taken control of his mind. Billy Flynn described how Pamela Smart had isolated him from his peers, how she had made him feel that their relationship was the most important thing in the world, how she had alternated between affection and withdrawal, warmth and coldness, drawing him closer and then pushing him away until he would do anything at all, to keep her. He described how she introduced the idea of eliminating Gregg, how she presented it not as a choice, but as a test of love. He described the pressure, the manipulation, the emotional leverage, and he described the night of May 1st in detail that no one watching would ever forget. Billy Flynn wept on the stand. Patrick Randall wept on the stand. These were not hardened criminals spinning elaborate lies. These were teenagers who had been pulled into something monstrous and were now facing the consequences. The prosecution played the Cecelia Pierce recordings for the jury. The courtroom heard Pamela Smart's voice, calm and controlled, discussing the aftermath, coaching a teenager on what to tell investigators. The contrast was devastating. Here was the grieving widow, the woman who had cried on television and worn black for weeks, calmly orchestrating a cover-up with the poise of someone who had done this kind of thinking before. Pamela Smart did not testify in her own defense. Her attorney advised against it. Whether that was the right decision would be debated for decades. The trial lasted 14 days. On March 22, 1991, the jury deliberated for approximately 13 hours. When they returned, the foreperson read the verdict. Guilty. On all counts. Pamela Smart showed no visible reaction. She stood perfectly still as the word was read, her face a mask. No tears, no breakdown, no dramatic collapse. The same composure that had served her so well in front of the cameras now worked against her. To the jury, to the millions watching at home, she looked like exactly what the prosecution had described. A woman who calculated everything. The sentence was automatic under New Hampshire law. Conspiracy to commit murder carried a mandatory sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole. There was no judicial discretion. There was no option for leniency. Pamela Smart was 23 years old, and she would spend the rest of her natural life behind bars. Now, let me tell you what happened to everyone else. Billy Flynn pleaded guilty to second-degree murder. He was sentenced to 28 years to life. He was eligible for parole after serving the minimum. In 2015, after 25 years in prison, Billy Flynn was released on parole. He was 40 years old. He had entered prison as a teenager and emerged as a middle-aged man. He changed his name. He moved to a new state. He started over. Patrick Randall also pleaded guilty. He received a sentence of 28 years to life. He was paroled in 2015 as well. Vance Latime Jr. pleaded guilty to being an accomplice. He received a shorter sentence and was released years earlier. Raymond Fowler, the getaway driver, testified for the prosecution and received a sentence that allowed for early release. Every single person who physically participated in the murder of Gregg Smart has been released from prison. Every one of them. The boy who pulled the trigger is free. The boys who held Gregg down are free. The driver is free. Pamela Smart, who was not in the condominium that night, who did not touch a weapon, who was miles away at a school meeting when her husband took his last breath, will die in prison. That is the paradox at the heart of this case, and it is the question that Miles' ghost hunter cannot stop thinking about. Let me be clear about something. I am not saying Pamela Smart is innocent. The evidence against her is overwhelming. The recordings, the testimony, the pattern of manipulation, the timeline, the motive, the insurance, the affair. She orchestrated the death of her husband. She used a child as an instrument. She exploited her authority, her position, her access to vulnerable young people to accomplish something unspeakable. There is no reasonable doubt about her involvement. But the question is not whether she is guilty. The question is whether the punishment is proportional, whether the system that freed the triggerman and locked away the planner forever is a system that makes sense. Whether justice was served, or whether something else happened in that courtroom, something driven by spectacle and outrage, and the particular fury that Americans reserve for women who refuse to behave the way women are expected to behave. Let me walk you through the logic, because the logic matters. Billy Flynn took a man's life. He walked into that condominium with a weapon. He pointed it at Gregg Smart. He made a choice in that final moment, a choice that no amount of manipulation can fully erase. He was 15, yes. He was influenced, yes. But he was there. He did it. And after 25 years, the state of New Hampshire decided that he had been rehabilitated, that he had paid his debt, that he deserved a second chance. Pamela Smart did not pull the trigger. She was not in the room. She did not hold the weapon. But she created the conditions. She identified the vulnerability. She exploited it. She built the plan. She provided access to the home. She established the alibi. She performed the aftermath. Without Pamela Smart, Gregg Smart would be alive today. He would be 59 years old. He might have coached that little league team. He might have grandchildren. So who bears more responsibility? The hand that acts, or the mind that commands the hand? This is not a new question. Philosophers have debated it for centuries. Legal systems around the world answer it differently. In some jurisdictions, the mastermind receives a harsher sentence than the executor. In others, the person who physically commits the act bears the greater burden. New Hampshire law, in 1991, drew a clear line. Conspiracy to commit murder carried a mandatory life sentence without parole. The judge had no discretion. The jury had no say in sentencing. The law was the law. But laws are written by people, and people can be wrong. Pamela Smart has petitioned for a sentence reduction multiple times. Every petition has been denied. The Smart family, Gregg's family, has appeared at every hearing to oppose any reduction. William Smart, Gregg's father, has said publicly that Pamela should never breathe free air again. He has said that she took his son and showed no remorse, and that mercy for her would be an insult to Gregg's memory. I understand that position. I respect the grief behind it. A father lost his son, a mother lost her boy. There is no sentence, no courtroom verdict, no legal outcome that can restore what was taken from the Smart family on May 1st, 1990. But I also understand the other side of the argument, the side that says a 23-year-old woman, however calculating, however manipulative, however guilty, should have some pathway, however narrow, to demonstrate that she is no longer the person she was 34 years ago. That a system which frees the executioner and entombs the planner is a system that has prioritized outrage over proportion. In 2022, New Hampshire Governor Chris Sununu denied Pamela Smart's petition for a commutation hearing. He did not grant her a hearing. He did not deny her commutation after a hearing. He denied her the hearing itself. He refused to even consider the question. When asked why, the governor's office released a statement indicating that the severity of the crime and the wishes of the victim's family were the determining factors. Miles GhostHunter sat with that statement for a long time, because here is what that statement really says. It says that no matter what Pamela Smart does, no matter how she changes, no matter what she becomes in the decades ahead, the answer will always be no. Not because of who she is now, but because of what she did then. And if the answer is always no, if rehabilitation is irrelevant, if change is impossible by definition, then the sentence is not really life without parole. It is a slow execution. It is death by calendar. Is that justice, or is that vengeance with a gavel? I do not have the answer. I am not sure anyone does. But the question matters, because the Pamela Smart case is not just about Pamela Smart. It is about how we decide what punishment means, whether prison is for rehabilitation or for retribution, whether we believe people can change, or whether some crimes place you beyond the reach of redemption forever. Now, there is another dimension to this case that I need to address, because it shaped the outcome in ways that most people do not fully appreciate. The media. The Pamela Smart trial was the first fully televised murder trial in American history. Let me say that again. The first. Before O.J. Simpson, before Casey Anthony, before any of the cases that would later define the intersection of criminal justice and entertainment. There was Pamela Smart. Court TV launched in 1991. The Pamela Smart trial was one of its earliest and most prominent cases. The network broadcast the proceedings live, gavel to gavel, and millions of Americans tuned in. They watched the testimony, they watched the cross-examinations, they watched the lawyers argue, and the witnesses weep, and the defendant sit motionless in her chair. And they formed opinions, strong opinions, opinions based not on the evidence as presented to the jury, but on the narrative as constructed by television producers, news anchors, and tabloid journalists. Pamela Smart was not just a defendant, she was a character. She was the Ice Queen, the Black Widow, the femme fatale. The media framed her not as a complex human being who had done a terrible thing, but as an archetype, a monster in heels, a predator in professional clothing. The coverage was relentless and deeply gendered. If Pamela Smart had been a man, a feature film called Court 2 was released. It was directed by Gus Van Sant and starred Nicole Kidman. It was loosely based on the Pamela Smart case. Kidman played a weather girl who manipulates a teenager into committing violence against her husband. The film was a critical success. Kidman was widely praised for her performance. The film was darkly funny, stylish, and entertaining. And somewhere in a New Hampshire prison, the real Pamela Smart watched as her life was turned into a punchline. I bring this up not to generate sympathy for Pamela Smart. She orchestrated the death of an innocent man. She manipulated a child. She deserves to be held accountable. But accountability and entertainment are not the same thing. And the media circus that surrounded her trial, the television movies, the feature films, the tabloid covers, all of it created an atmosphere in which mercy became impossible. You cannot parole a character. You cannot commute the sentence of a villain. The media made Pamela Smart into something larger than a human being, and in doing so, it ensured that she would never be treated as one again. Let me tell you about Gregg Smart's family for a moment, because they deserve to be heard too. William Smart, Gregg's father, has been a presence at every parole hearing, every petition, every legal proceeding related to the case for over 3 decades. He is an old man now. He has spent more years fighting to keep Pamela Smart in prison than his son spent alive. Think about that. William Smart has devoted more of his life to the aftermath of his son's murder than Gregg Smart had years on this earth. William Smart has said that he will continue to fight until his last breath. That Pamela Smart showed no mercy to Gregg and therefore deserves none herself. That the only justice is the justice that was handed down in 1991, and that any modification of that sentence would be a betrayal of his son's memory. Judith Smart, Gregg's mother, has spoken less publicly, but her grief has been no less visible. She has attended every hearing. She has written letters to every governor. She has made it clear that the Smart family will never consent to Pamela's release. And the system has listened, every time, without exception. In the American legal system, Victim impact is a powerful force. The wishes of the victim's family carry enormous weight, particularly in cases involving potential sentence reductions. When the Smart family shows up and says no, the politicians listen. No governor wants to be the person who freed the woman who ordered the killing of Gregg Smart. The political cost is too high. The optics are too terrible. So the decision is never really about justice. It is about politics. It is about optics. It is about the next election cycle. And Pamela Smart remains where she has been for 34 years, in a cell, growing old, waiting for an answer that will never come. Let me go back to Billy Flynn for a moment. Billy Flynn was released from prison in 2015 after serving 25 years. He was 40 years old. He had entered the New Hampshire State Prison for Men as a boy and left as a man with grey in his hair. He had spent more time incarcerated than he had spent free before the crime. Upon his release, Billy Flynn changed his legal name. He relocated. He has not spoken publicly about the case since his release. He has, by all available accounts, lived a quiet, law-abiding life. The parole board that approved his release determined that Billy Flynn had been rehabilitated, that he had accepted responsibility for his actions, that he had served his time and earned the right to re-enter society. Nobody protested his release, not really. There were some news stories, some brief mentions in the New Hampshire press, but there was no public outcry, no campaign to keep him locked up, no governor refusing to even consider the question, and that asymmetry is what haunts this case. The person who took Gregg Smart's life is free. The person who planned it is not. The hand is pardoned. The mind is condemned. Dalia, the 13th of April, 2026, 1702. Gregg Smart, who was miles away at a school meeting when the act was carried out, will never be free. She is serving life without the possibility of parole. She has been in prison for over 34 years. She will die in prison unless the governor of New Hampshire grants clemency, which no governor has been willing to do. And that is the paradox that Miles, Ghost Hunter, wants you to sit with. Because this case is not simple. Nothing about it is simple. And anyone who tells you otherwise is selling you something. Let me walk you through both sides. On one side, you have the argument that Pamela Smart is exactly where she belongs. She was the architect. She was the planner. She was the adult who exploited a child, manipulated his emotions, weaponized his adolescent devotion, and pointed him at her husband like a loaded gun. Without Pamela Smart, Gregg Smart would be alive today. He would be 59 years old. He might have coached that little league team. He might have watched his children graduate from college. He might be sitting on a porch in Derry right now, grey-haired and content, complaining about the Red Sox. Pamela Smart took all of that away, not with her hands, with her mind. And the law recognizes that the person who plans a crime, who sets it in motion, who recruits and manipulates the people who carry it out, bears the greatest moral responsibility. The triggerman is a weapon. The person who aims the weapon is the killer. By that logic, life without parole is not excessive. It is proportional. On the other side, you have the argument that the sentence is a relic, that it reflects the hysteria of a media-saturated trial rather than a sober assessment of justice. That Billy Flynn, who actually took Gregg Smart's life with his own hands, served his time and is now free, while Pamela Smart, who was not present when Gregg died, will never breathe free air again. The disparity is staggering. The person who committed the physical act received a sentence with a path to release. The person who planned it received a sentence with no path at all. And you can argue that this makes sense legally. You can argue that conspiracy carries its own weight. But you cannot argue that it feels balanced. Because it does not. In 2015, when Billy Flynn walked out of prison a free man, Gregg Smart's family supported his release. Let me say that again. The victim's family supported the release of the man who took Gregg's life. William Smart, Gregg's father, told reporters that he believed Billy Flynn had been genuinely manipulated. that he had been a child caught in the web of an adult predator, and that 25 years was sufficient punishment. But when Pamela Smart petitioned for a sentence commutation, William Smart was equally clear. No, never. She should die in prison. The family of the victim saw a distinction between the puppet and the puppeteer, and while you may agree or disagree with that distinction, you cannot deny its clarity. Let me give you more context. In 2022, Pamela Smart appeared before a hearing in New Hampshire to petition for a commutation of her sentence. She had been in prison for 32 years at that point. She was 54 years old. She had earned multiple degrees behind bars. She had mentored other inmates. She had maintained a clean disciplinary record. By every metric used to evaluate rehabilitation, Pamela Smart was a model prisoner. At the hearing, she expressed remorse. She said she took responsibility for her role in Gregg's death. She said she was not the same person she had been at 22. The Executive Council voted unanimously to deny her petition, 5-0. Gregg Smart's family was present at the hearing. They opposed commutation. They had not changed their position in 32 years, and they were not going to change it now. Pamela Smart returned to her cell at the Bedford Hills Correctional Facility in New York, where she had been transferred years earlier. She will remain there, barring extraordinary intervention, for the rest of her life. Now, I want to take a step back from the legal arguments and the courtroom drama and talk about something that this case illuminated in a way that few cases before it had done. I want to talk about power. Because the Pamela Smart case is fundamentally a case about power, about who has it, how it is used, and what happens when it is abused. Pamela Smart had power over Billy Flynn. That is not debatable. She was an adult. He was a child. She was his supervisor at school. He was her student volunteer. She had authority conferred by institution, by age, by position. And she used that authority not to educate, not to mentor, not to guide, but to manipulate and exploit. The grooming pattern in the Pamela Smart case has since been studied by psychologists and criminologists as a textbook example of adult on minor manipulation. The stages are recognizable: identification of a vulnerable target, isolation from peers, establishment of emotional dependency, gradual erosion of boundaries, introduction of physical intimacy as a bonding mechanism, and finally, the leverage, the moment when the relationship is weaponized, when the affection that was cultivated so carefully is used as a tool of coercion. Do this for me, or I will take it all away. That is not love, that is control. And when a 22-year-old woman exerts that kind of control over a 15-year-old boy, the law has a word for it. Several words, actually. None of them are flattering. But here is where it gets complicated, because power does not exist in a vacuum. And the same system that correctly identified Pamela Smart as a manipulator also sentenced a child to 28 years in prison. The same legal framework that recognized Billy Flynn as a victim of adult manipulation also required him to spend a quarter of a century behind bars before he could even be considered for release. Billy Flynn was 15 when he committed the act that defined his life. 15. He could not legally drive a car. He could not vote. He could not buy a beer. But the state of New Hampshire determined that he was competent to be tried as an adult, and sentenced as an adult, and imprisoned as an adult. Was he a victim? Yes. Was he also a perpetrator? Yes. Can someone be both things at once? The Pamela Smart case forces you to answer that question, and there is no comfortable answer. Let me tell you something else about this case that rarely gets discussed: the media. The trial of Pamela Smart was a watershed moment in American media history. It was the first murder trial broadcast live in its entirety on television. Court TV built its brand on this trial. The networks covered it like a sporting event. Commentators analyzed each day's testimony. Legal experts debated strategy. The public watched, riveted, from their living rooms. And in the process, something changed. The trial became entertainment. The defendant became a character. The victim became a prop. The complex, agonizing, morally ambiguous reality of what had happened in that condominium on Misty Morning Drive was compressed into a narrative that could be consumed in hourly segments between commercial breaks. Pamela Smart became the Black Widow, the femme fatale, the Ice Queen. The media created a mythology around her that was simpler and more dramatic than the truth. She was either a monster or a martyr, depending on which channel you watched. There was no middle ground. Middle ground does not generate ratings. And the question that nobody asked at the time, but that I am asking now, is this. Did the media coverage affect the outcome? Did the fact that millions of people were watching influence the jury? Did the pressure of a national audience make it harder for 12 citizens of Rockingham County to deliberate calmly, rationally, without the weight of public expectation on their shoulders? We will never know for certain. Jurors in the Pamela Smart trial have maintained that they were not influenced by the media coverage. But the question lingers, and it has lingered for 34 years. There is one more element of this case that I want to address, because it is the element that makes this case different from almost every other case I have covered. And that element is time. Time has done something strange to the Pamela Smart case. It has not resolved the moral questions. It has sharpened them. In 1991, when Pamela Smart was sentenced to life without parole, the sentence felt proportional to many people. A young woman had orchestrated her husband's murder. She had used a child to do it. She showed no remorse at trial. The sentence was severe, but the crime was severe. But that was 34 years ago. And in those 34 years, the world has changed. Our understanding of adolescent brain development has changed. Our understanding of coercion and manipulation has changed. Our sentencing philosophies have changed. The Supreme Court has ruled that mandatory life without parole sentences for juveniles are unconstitutional. States across the country have re-examined harsh sentences imposed decades earlier and concluded that they no longer serve the interests of justice. And yet Pamela Smart remains in prison. She was not a juvenile when she committed her crime, so the new rulings on juvenile sentencing do not apply to her. But the evolving standards that produce those rulings, the recognition that people can change, that redemption is possible, that a sentence imposed in the heat of public outrage may not reflect the considered judgment of a mature society. Those standards hover over her case like a question mark. Is 34 years enough? Is 40 years enough? Is any number of years enough when a 24-year-old man lost his life because the woman he loved decided he was worth more dead than alive? I do not have the answer, and I am suspicious of anyone who claims they do. But I will tell you this: Gregg Smart is still 24. He will always be 24. He will never coach Little League. He will never hold his children. He will never grow old in Derry, New Hampshire, complaining about the Red Sox. He is frozen in time, forever young, forever silent, forever gone. His parents spent decades fighting to keep Pamela Smart in prison. His father, William Smart, made it his life's mission. Gregg's mother, Judith Smart, carried the weight of her son's death every single day until her own death. They never recovered. Parents of murdered children rarely do. The grief does not diminish with time. It calcifies. It becomes part of the bone. Billy Flynn is out. He has a new name, a new life, a second chance that Gregg Smart will never have. Whether he deserves that second chance is a question that depends entirely on what you believe about human nature. Can a person who committed an act of violence at 15, under the influence of an adult manipulator, be redeemed? Can 25 years in prison transform a frightened boy into a responsible man? Billy Flynn's parole board believed so. Gregg Smart's family believed so. The state of New Hampshire believed so. Pamela Smart's parole board, on the other hand, has never believed that she has been sufficiently punished. Not after 10 years, not after 20 years, not after 30 years, not after 34 years. And here is the thing that keeps me up at night when I think about this case. The reason Pamela Smart will never be released is not primarily because of the severity of her crime, although the severity is undeniable. It is because she was the planner. She was the brain. And the system treats the brain differently than it treats the hands. The person who conceives the crime is punished more harshly than the person who executes it, because society has decided that cold calculation is more dangerous than hot-blooded action. The person who pulls the trigger in a moment of manipulated passion can be rehabilitated. The person who spends months carefully constructing the circumstances that lead to the trigger being pulled, that person, the system believes, is fundamentally different, fundamentally more dangerous, fundamentally less redeemable. Is that true? Is the planner always more culpable than the executioner? Is manipulation worse than violence? Is a cold mind more dangerous than a willing hand? These are the questions that the Pamela Smart case has been asking for 34 years. And in 34 years, no one has provided a satisfying answer. Let me bring this back to the personal, because the Pamela Smart case is not just a legal puzzle or a philosophical exercise. It is a story about real people whose lives were destroyed by the choices of one woman. Gregg Smart's friends still gather every year on the anniversary of his death. They remember him as he was, young, smiling, easygoing. They talk about the things he would have done, the life he would have lived. They raise a glass and they say his name, and for a moment, he is 24 again, alive and full of possibility. Pamela Smart's parents, John and Linda Wojcik, have spent more than 3 decades advocating for their daughter. They believe she was unfairly convicted. They believe the teenagers lied to save themselves. They believe the media turned their daughter into a monster. They visit her in prison. They write letters to governors. They have aged decades in the fight, and they have not given up. Billy Flynn's family has largely disappeared from public view. After his release, he slipped into anonymity. He does not give interviews. He does not make public statements. Whatever he carries inside him, he carries it quietly, in a new town, under a new name, where no one knows what he did when he was 15 years old. Cecelia Pierce, the teenager who wore the wire, has also retreated from the spotlight. She was 16 when she agreed to help the police. She was 17 when she testified at trial. She carried the weight of that decision for the rest of her life. She was not a detective. She was not a trained operative. She was a scared teenager who made a brave choice, and that choice helped convict a killer. And it also meant that she would spend the rest of her life knowing that she had betrayed someone who trusted her. Was it the right thing to do? Absolutely. Was it easy? Not for a single moment. These are the people of the Pamela Smart case, not characters in a true crime drama, not archetypes in a morality play. People. Complicated, flawed, damaged people who were caught in a storm that one woman created and that none of them could control. I want to talk about something else now. I want to talk about the cultural impact of this case, because it was enormous, and it changed things in ways that are still visible today. The trial of Pamela Smart did not just introduce America to televised courtroom drama. It introduced America to the idea of the true crime spectacle as a form of entertainment. Before Pamela Smart, murder trials were reported in newspapers. After Pamela Smart, murder trials were broadcast live. Before Pamela Smart, the public's relationship with criminal justice was mediated by journalists who summarized and contextualized. After Pamela Smart, the public watched raw, unfiltered courtroom footage and drew their own conclusions. This was a revolution. And like all revolutions, it had consequences that no one anticipated. The O.J. Simpson trial in 1995, which is often cited as the moment when America became obsessed with televised justice, was a direct descendant of the Pamela Smart trial. The infrastructure was built in Exeter, New Hampshire, in 1991. The cameras, the commentary, the expert panels, the daily analysis, all of it was pioneered during the Pamela Smart case. Court TV learned its craft on Pamela Smart. The networks learned that crime sells on Pamela Smart. The public learned that watching a trial could be as compelling as watching a drama on Pamela Smart. And in 1995, the filmmaker Joyce Maynard wrote a novel called To Die For, which was inspired by the Pamela Smart case. The novel was adapted into a film directed by Gus Van Sant, starring Nicole Kidman as a thinly veiled version of Pamela Smart. The film was a critical success. Nicole Kidman's performance was celebrated as one of the finest of her career. She played the character as charming, manipulative, narcissistic, and completely devoid of empathy. A woman who saw other people as instruments to be used and discarded. The film took liberties with the facts, as films do, but it captured something essential about the case. It captured the idea that ambition without conscience is a form of evil, that charm without empathy is a weapon, that the most dangerous people in the world are not the ones who act on impulse, but the ones who plan with precision and smile while they do it. Pamela Smart has always maintained that the film distorted her story. She has always maintained that the media portrayal of her as a cold, calculating manipulator is unfair. She has always maintained her innocence, or at least her version of innocence, which includes the acknowledgement that she had an inappropriate relationship with Billy Flynn, but denies that she orchestrated the death of her husband. In multiple interviews from prison, Pamela Smart has said that she was young, that she made terrible choices, that the relationship with Billy Flynn was wrong, but that she never asked anyone to harm Gregg. She has said that the teenagers acted on their own, that the recordings were misinterpreted, that the trial was a circus, that the jury was prejudiced by media coverage. Is she telling the truth? The jury did not think so. The appeals courts did not think so. The parole boards have not thought so. But Pamela Smart continues to maintain her position, year after year, decade after decade, from behind the walls of Bedford Hills Correctional Facility. And here is something worth considering. If Pamela Smart is telling the truth, if she really did not plan the murder, if she was genuinely innocent of the conspiracy charge, then she has spent 34 years in prison for a crime she did not commit. That would make her one of the longest-serving, wrongfully convicted prisoners in American history. But the evidence says otherwise. The recordings say otherwise. The testimony of 4 teenagers, given independently and corroborating each other in critical details, says otherwise. The pattern of manipulation documented by investigators and psychologists says otherwise. Sometimes the simplest explanation is the correct one. And the simplest explanation of the Pamela Smart case is that a young woman wanted her husband dead, found a vulnerable teenager to do the job, and got caught because teenagers talk. That is the story. It has been the story for 34 years, and unless new evidence emerges, it will be the story forever. Let me tell you about the last time I visited Derry, New Hampshire. I went to Misty Morning Drive. The condominium complex is still there. The units look the same as they did in 1990, maybe a little older, a little more weathered. New families live there now. They park their cars in the same lot where Pamela Smart parked hers. They walk through the same doors. They have no idea, most of them, that a young man lost his life in one of those units more than 3 decades ago. That is the cruelest thing about time. It erases. Not the facts, not the records, not the legal precedents, but the visceral reality of loss. The feeling that a real person, with a real life and real dreams, was here one day and gone the next. I stood on that sidewalk for a long time. I thought about Gregg Smart. I thought about what he might have become. I thought about the unfairness of it, the randomness that is not random at all. The way that one person's selfish calculation can erase another person's entire future. And then I drove to the courthouse in Exeter, where the trial took place. The building is still there too. It looks ordinary. It looks like 100 other county courthouses in New England. You would never know, looking at it, that something happened inside those walls that changed American media forever. that destroyed half a dozen lives, that created a legal paradox that scholars are still debating. Buildings do not remember, but people do. I have spent a long time thinking about this case, longer than most, and the conclusion I have reached is not a conclusion at all. It is a question, and the question is this: what do we want our justice system to do? Do we want it to punish? Then Pamela Smart's sentence is justified. She planned a murder. She used a child to execute it. She deserves the harshest punishment available. Do we want it to rehabilitate? Then Pamela Smart's sentence is a failure. She has spent 34 years in prison. She has changed. She has grown. She has done everything the system asks of prisoners who seek redemption, and the system has refused to acknowledge any of it. Do we want it to deter? Then Pamela Smart's sentence is a message that says, if you plan a murder, if you manipulate others to carry it out, if you sit back and let someone else take the risk while you maintain your alibi, the system will find you, and the system will never let you go. Do we want it to be proportional? Then Pamela Smart's sentence is a problem, because the people who actually carried out the violence are free, and the person who planned it is not. And proportionality requires, at minimum, a coherent relationship between the severity of the act and the severity of the punishment. The truth is, we want all of these things simultaneously, and they contradict each other. We want punishment and rehabilitation. We want deterrence and proportionality. We want justice and mercy. And in the gap between these competing desires, real human beings spend real years in real cells, growing old, while the world outside moves on without them. Pamela Smart is 56 years old as I record this. She has been in prison for more than half her life. She will almost certainly die in prison. That is the reality. Gregg Smart would have been 59. He will never be 59. That is also the reality. Billy Flynn is in his early 40s, living somewhere in America under a name that nobody recognizes. He works a job. He pays his taxes. He tries to be normal. Whether he succeeds, whether the weight of what he did at 15 ever lifts, whether he sleeps soundly or lies awake in the small hours, remembering a dark condominium and a man who begged for his life, I do not know. He does not talk about it. Maybe he never will. Patrick Randall is also free, also living quietly, also carrying whatever it is that you carry when you participated in the taking of a human life before you were old enough to vote. Vance Latime Jr. is free. Raymond Fowler is free. Cecelia Pierce, the girl with the wire, is somewhere in her late 40s now. She did a brave thing when she was 16 years old, a thing that cost her friendships, her sense of safety, her peace of mind. She helped convict a woman who had manipulated her, and she paid for it in ways that no courtroom transcript can capture. And the Smart family, Gregg's family, they are still here, still carrying the loss, still showing up at hearings to oppose Pamela's release, still saying the same thing they have been saying since 1990. She does not deserve to be free. Who is right? Is anyone right? Is this a case where right and wrong even apply? Or is it a case where the categories themselves collapse under the weight of what happened? I have been Miles' ghost hunter for a long time now. I have covered cases that made me angry, cases that made me sad, cases that made me question everything I thought I knew about human nature. But the Pamela Smart case is different. It does not resolve. It does not settle into a neat narrative with a clear moral. It just sits there, year after year, decade after decade, asking questions that nobody can answer. She cried at the funeral. She wore black for weeks. She told everyone she had lost the love of her life. And maybe, in some twisted, narcissistic, self-serving way, she had. Maybe Pamela Smart did love Gregg Smart. In whatever limited capacity she was capable of love. Maybe she loved him and wanted him gone at the same time. Maybe the human heart is capable of holding both things simultaneously, love and calculation, grief and relief, tears and planning. Or maybe the tears were just another performance, another manipulation, another tool in the arsenal of a woman who saw the entire world as a stage and every person in it as a prop. I do not know. After 34 years and thousands of pages of court documents and hundreds of hours of testimony and analysis, I still do not know. And the fact that I do not know is, in itself, the most honest thing I can say about this case. Gregg Smart is still 24. He will always be 24. He will always be the young man who walked through his own front door on a Tuesday evening in May, expecting nothing, suspecting nothing, trusting that the world was what it appeared to be. It was not. It never was. And by the time he understood that, it was too late. Before I close this file, I want to address something directly. I want to address the question that I know many of you are thinking. The question that comes up every time this case is discussed, in every true crime forum, in every comment section, in every late-night conversation about justice and punishment and the limits of the law. The question is this: should Pamela Smart ever be released? I have given you the facts. I have given you the arguments on both sides. I have given you the context and the nuance and the moral complexity. And now, I am going to tell you what I think. I think that Pamela Smart did what the prosecution said she did. I think she planned the murder of her husband. I think she manipulated a child to carry it out. I think she exploited her position of authority, her age, her charm, and her willingness to cross lines that most people would never dream of crossing. I think the evidence supports the jury's verdict. And I think the jury got it right. But I also think that life without the possibility of parole is a sentence that should be reserved for people who cannot be rehabilitated, people who pose an ongoing threat to society, people who, if released, would harm again. Is that Pamela Smart? After 34 years, at 56 years old, with multiple degrees and a clean disciplinary record and decades of model behavior? I do not know. And that uncertainty is exactly why the system should at least have the mechanism to ask the question, not to guarantee release, not to excuse the crime, but to ask, is this person the same person she was at 22? And if the answer is no, what does justice require? New Hampshire law does not allow for that question. The sentence is absolute. Life means life. There is no parole hearing, no judicial review, no mechanism for reassessment. The only path to freedom is executive clemency, which requires the governor to take a political risk that no governor has been willing to take. And so, Pamela Smart remains in prison, and the debate continues. And Gregg Smart remains 24, and the questions remain unanswered. That is the Pamela Smart case. That is the story of a man who trusted his wife, a wife who trusted a teenager who trusted a woman who was incapable of trust, and a system that delivered a verdict but could not deliver closure. Miles GhostHunter here. I told you at the beginning that some widows grieve and others orchestrate. I told you that this case proved it on tape. And it did. But what the tape could not capture, what no recording device in the world can capture, is the full weight of what was lost on the night of May 1st, 1990. A young man's life, a family's peace, a teenager's innocence, a community's trust. All of it, gone, traded for nothing. For insurance money that was never collected, for freedom that was never achieved, for a plan that was perfect on paper and catastrophic in reality. Pamela Smart had a plan. It was meticulous. It was detailed. It was, by any objective measure, well constructed. There was only one flaw. Teenagers talk. And that is the lesson that this case teaches, if it teaches anything at all, that the perfect plan does not exist, that the human element is always the weak link, that you can manipulate people, you can control them, you can bend them to your will, but you cannot make them keep a secret, not forever. Not when the secret is the size of a man's life. Pamela Smart thought she had accounted for everything. She had not accounted for the fact that 15-year-olds tell their friends things. She had not accounted for the fact that guilt is corrosive, that it eats through silence like acid through metal. She had not accounted for the fact that Cecelia Pierce, the loyal student, the trusted confidant, would choose conscience over loyalty when the moment came. And when Cecelia Pierce walked into that room wearing a wire, the perfect plan died. It died quietly, without drama, without a confrontation, without a single raised voice. It died because a 16-year-old girl decided that the truth mattered more than friendship. That is the end of the Pamela Smart case. But it is not the end of the story. Because the story continues every day that Pamela Smart wakes up in Bedford Hills, every day that Billy Flynn goes to work under a name that is not his own, every day that Gregg Smart's father looks at his son's photograph and remembers what was taken. The story has no ending, only a pause, a long, uncomfortable, unresolved pause, and we are all still sitting in it. Pamela Smart used a teenager as a weapon. She aimed him at her husband and pulled the trigger without ever touching the gun. It was cold. It was calculated. It was, in its own terrible way, brilliant. But in our next case, the weapon was not a person. It was patience. 20 years of patience. A secret buried so deep that everyone forgot it existed. Everyone except the person who buried it. Episode 8. A secret he thought no one would ever discover. Miles, Ghost Hunter. I will see you there.